Okay. The next talk is the title is Real-World Classification of Caregiver Sensitivity to Infant Distress. So the speaker is Anna. Yes. So if you are ready, please start.
Testing. You can hear me in the back. Yep, thank you. All right. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for making it back after a delicious lunch. Like the chair said, my name is Madden-Rusnak. I'm a research scientist at the Dell Medical School at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm really excited to present this work on behalf of my former lab mate, Priyanka Khante, and my former advisor, Barbaro, and myself, titled Real-World Classification of Caregiver Sensitivity to Infant Distress. So theoretical empirical work highlights that caregiver sensitivity, which refers to the correct interpretation of signals from infants as well as the appropriate response to these signals from caregivers, is essential in predicting later social-emotional development. In particular, it appears that the quality of responses around distress are especially important for predicting these long-term outcomes. For example, longitudinal work has found that caregivers' sensitivity to their infant's distress when they were 6 months old predicted later toddler behavior problems, but their sensitivity during play or non-distress periods did not, showcasing the differential impact of these particular interactions in development. The phenomenon behind this effect is that sensitive responses effectively soothe the infant in real time, and over repeated instances, infants develop expectations and skills important for attachment and self-regulation. So we had the goal of developing a caregiver sensitivity classifier that can be used to improve caregiving practices. In particular, we wanted to facilitate processes where insensitivity to infant distress could be objectively and automatically assessed in order to reach a wider application of existing evidence-based interventions, which hopefully would improve secure attachment and better social-emotional outcomes for a wider range of families. These are really time-intensive evaluations, and so if we can automate some of them, we can hopefully reach more people. Data used in our model development come from a previously collected data set which included 87 mother-infant dyads from the city of Austin, Texas in the United States. Infants in the sample range from 0 to 10 months of age, and we had a fairly racially diverse distribution with only about half of our sample being white and non-Hispanic. The sample was mostly highly educated with almost a third completing a graduate degree. Those are the caregivers. And a near equal percentage of mothers in our sample worked either full-time or did not work outside of the home. And data for this algorithm come from continuous infant-centered audio from Lena that is collected over 72 hours over the course of a week as families go about their everyday life. The data we used for training this model come from 32 full-day recordings from unique participants that were semi-randomly selected based on infant age from this larger data set. These full-day audio recordings went through multiple passes of annotation, the first being infant distress, which included annotating all infant fuss and cry vocalizations across the full day recording. And we grouped individual fuss and cry vocalizations into distress episodes if they recurred within 5 minutes of one another with no limit to the length of these groupings. And by making distress episodes rather than just looking at distress vocalizations, we can make better comparisons to traditional caregiver sensitivity assessments, which typically take place across several minutes of observation. These annotation efforts resulted in 387 infant distress episodes across 768 hours of audio data. Next, for each episode of distress, we have the automatically annotated female and male adult speech from Lena outputs to see exactly when caregivers are responding to infant distress and how much speech they're producing across these episodes. Then, for every distress episode, we have the overall caregiver sensitivity scores rated on a scale from 1 being least sensitive to 7 being the most sensitive responses. And these are inspired by traditional assessments of caregiver sensitivity. For our model, we transformed these 1 to 7 scores into 115 low sensitivity ratings for scores between 1 and 4, and 272 high sensitivity ratings based on scores from 5 to 7. Now here's an example of one dyad's data, which has 6 distress episodes across a full day's recording. Their distress episodes range from less than 2 minutes to almost 10 minutes or 600 seconds. We organized these distress episodes along the y-axis by their sensitivity rating, with higher scores above this dyad's lower sensitivity episodes. See that for each one of these, each distress vocalization is coded green or bluish, as you can see on the projector, for fuss, and red for cry, as well as automatically detected caregiver sensitivity vocalizations in black. And you can see some differences right off the bat. For example, the bottom low sensitivity episode has a long latency before a caregiver responds to a cry, or in the one directly above it, we can see no response at all to this long fuss. We took these observations and investigated more of our sample to see if we could find features that could be used to differentiate between high and low sensitivity responses. Now, early on in my PhD work, I recall Kai and I debating if predicting maternal sensitivity was possible, which, as the person who is painstakingly annotating all of these episodes, I said no. If it's hard for me, there's no way an algorithm can do it. Luckily, we are data and not ego-driven, and we ended up finding some compelling patterns that when we looked at the data. For example, when we examined the latency between the first distress vocalization and the first adult speech detected for these distress episodes with high, medium, or low sensitivity scores, we found that lower sensitivity scores were associated with significantly longer average latency compared to distress episodes with medium or high sensitivity scores. So it's taking longer for parents to respond. We also found that for distress episodes with low sensitivity scores, there was a significantly lower overall rate or proportion of female adult speech. And now female caregivers are doing the majority of caregiving in our sample, responding to about 70% of responses, infant distress vocalizations overall. And so this was very significant. And these preliminary trends made us hopeful that these kinds of features could be provided to a model to classify sensitivity. However, there are still a number of technical challenges for developing a model for classifying multifaceted social interactions, as you can imagine. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these in too much detail, but broadly, patterns of everyday infant distress are highly variable in their duration, as you can see here in this histogram. And they're also highly variable in their intensity, with unreliable switches between fusses and cries across the day, like we saw in our example from that earlier slide. Additionally, there's long-range dependencies that must account for multiscalar dynamics. For example, a delayed response may be appropriate if the distress is mild enough, but in the same distress episode, and if it might escalate to screaming, and the degree of response from caregivers would also need to increase. A model would need to have sustained contextual awareness over extended time frames that consider both immediate responses as well as the history of responses across a distress episode in order to classify the overall caregiver sensitivity. Finally, as I earlier begrudged, this kind of data is incredibly time-consuming to code. And while this is a larger data set for psychological research, it's too small for deep network approaches that could, in theory, learn these complex dependencies. With these challenges in mind, we nonetheless pursued model development. The first thing we had to consider was that these kind of interactions and activities are multiscalar. Therefore, their classification must be as well. There was no perfect framework for us to leverage for this application, so we needed to make our own. Broadly, Priyanka built a model that integrated aspects from both sequential and hierarchical methods that also leveraged our own domain knowledge as developmentalists to make our own framework to classify caregiver sensitivity. Behavior classification algorithms are typically made using a frame or atomic scale approach, which in our data set include fine-grained audio details of the acoustic features of both infant and caregiver vocalizations. However, building on that, our next scale included event-level data to account for the temporal complexities of these activities, such as median latency of vocal responsiveness to individual distress vocalizations, to account for that immediate context that matters when considering the overall picture. And then to look at that longer pattern of behavior, we included state scale data to characterize patterns of behavior across the distress episode, which included variables such as the proportion of time caregivers spent responding to distress and the frequency of returning to these responsive states across the distress episode. So it's not just how you respond to one distress vocalization, but how you respond to them overall. And now this kind of approach can be widely applied to a multitude of social behavior interactions in psychology. And so what we really want to do with this algorithm is encourage creative thinking about how this can be applied to a number of different types of interactions. We first compared our model against two baseline models, the first being a conventional frame random forest model, which reflects the more common approach to activity recognition modeling, where features are extracted using a sliding window technique and summarized through statistical aggregation. Our second baseline was a deep learning model used to benchmark our model performance against state-of-the-art activity recognition methods using pre-trained transformers, which are better suited to capture long training dependencies. And as I said, we weren't really able to fine-tune these hyperparameters, but we did want to include this model. These baseline models achieved F1 scores of 0.699 and 0.632 respectively. However, our multiscalar model that included frame, event, and state-level data achieved an F1 score of 0.76, outperforming both baseline models in precision and recall as well. We then performed an incremental temporal scale analysis to assess the contributions of each of our scales to our model's performance. Among the individual feature sets, the frame-only model, which captured the fine-grained acoustic characteristics, like I said, this performed the best, and this aligns with prior research showing that general acoustic features are highly effective in auditory activity recognition tasks. However, despite its strong performance, this model's inability to capture long-range dependencies and caregiver responsiveness patterns over an entire distress episode limit its effectiveness for caregiver sensitivity classification. Next, we found that combining two temporal scales consistently outperformed all of our single-scale models, demonstrating the complementary nature of different temporal perspectives. The frame plus state combination yielded the highest improvement, outperforming the frame-only model by 4.7%. And this suggests that augmenting short-term spectral features with high-level interaction patterns provides broader contextual information beneficial for classification. However, as I shared in our prior result, our best performance was found using 3 temporal scales, which outperformed the frame-only model by 8.7%. The substantial improvement from incorporating all 3 scales underscores the importance of leveraging temporally diverse features for robust classification in tasks with complex, hierarchically structured activities. So we have a model, it works, and it's really wonderful. However, we're making several adaptations to make an open source model that really doesn't rely on the need for human annotated infant distress. To investigate this possibility, we tested a version of our caregiver sensitivity model that does not require any human annotated fuss versus cry annotations. So we removed these fuss cry annotations while retaining those based on general distress because, if you're familiar with our prior work, we do have algorithms that reliably detect caregiver or infant distress over and above Lena or other commercial cry detection models. And while this adapted model still outperformed the best baseline model by 3.6% with an F1 of 0.725, this was still a 4.7 decrease in accuracy compared to the full model. This decrease in accuracy makes sense as judgments of caregiver sensitivity consider the balance between the level of infant distress and the appropriateness of caregiver's response based on these levels. So you really need that context of how distressed was the infant. Therefore, we're currently building a very promising model to differentiate the levels of distress automatically, so please be on the lookout for this work. Very excited to share that. Additionally, we have a number of planned improvements, including adding data from our recently started longitudinal NIDA R01 study that will also help us increase the language diversity of our training data to include more Spanish-speaking families. We will also be including more dyads who are at higher risk for insensitivity and insecure attachment, which may balance out our event distributions as well. And this new data inclusion will come with a multi-pronged validation plan, which could mean additional algorithm validity, as well as assessments of both concurrent and prospective validity. And so as I kind of zoom out from this talk, I want to talk that our group is very passionate about improving the field's understanding and the use of these activity recognition algorithms. So we have a paper currently under review that covers a broad set of lessons for both consumers of this kind of work and those who want to pursue it. So please be on the lookout for that soon as well. I want to thank my former advisor, Kaya, and Priyanka, and as well as the rest of the Daily Activity Lab. And then while I take questions, I want to leave this up here because we currently have a call out for papers on different sensing modalities and using this kind of work to study the natural statistics of infant behavior. So please feel free to ask me questions about this or submit your abstract for consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe I can take one question from audience. Do you have any questions? No? No?
Okay.
Yes. So I have one question. So could you show me the result? Actually, I understand that your multiscale approach got 0.76 performance. So what is the kind of satisfactory level? The satisfactory level of the performance. So in your case.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I think getting something, of course we want at the highest F1 score achievable for sure. But I think when considering the performance of a model that's looking at such a context dependent, we're usually listening to multiple bouts across an entire day of like parents responding to infant distress. The fact that it can get a F1 score of 0.76, I think is actually incredibly promising. And we're hoping with additional fine-tuning parameters and expanding our training data set that we can get that higher. But if you would have asked me a couple years ago if this was possible, I would have said no way. And so I'm really pleased to see these numbers at this point.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So maybe time is up. So yeah, let's move on to the next presentation. Thank you very much.